Welcome to For the Church, podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my regular conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. So here we are near the end, not at the end, but near the end of our season on Sacraments, season whatever. Doesn't matter. It's the Sacrament season, and we'll forever refer to it as the Sacrament season. But we've talked about sacraments in the Old Testament. We've talked about sacraments in the New Testament. We've talked about baptism. We've talked about Lord's Supper. We've talked about controversial things. We've probably made a few people kind of upset. Maybe we've made some people laugh. Hopefully, in some sense, we've made you cry tears of joy over the graciousness of the Lord. Kind of a goal? Not necessarily, but kind of a goal. And so here we are near the end where we're going to ask a little bit more questions about sacraments across the Bible, differences and similarities. But before we do that, hey Seth, how are you?
I'm good. I have laughed a lot. I've shed no tears, and I haven't been too upset.
Well, that's good. I've laughed a lot. It's been a lot of fun.
You haven't been upset, though.
I've not been upset.
Okay, that's good.
Well, I might get upset, but if I get upset, 90% of the time, it's I'm getting upset with me. I get really frustrated with me. So any comments in the comment section that are at me, chances are I've said way worse stuff today about me. So you're probably not going to hurt my feelings. But that's okay. Anyway, I don't know how we got there.
Let's talk about sacraments.
So let's talk about sacraments. So again, we set this up and structured it to be somewhat biblical, theological. The study of biblical theology is the manner in which throughout the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, a particular thing unfolds in a certain way, right? Because it's not, Genesis 1, and then suddenly downloaded in Genesis 1 is like all the information you learned, Trinity and Jesus and the crucifixion and resurrection, and the Lord reveals himself, his nature, but he does so progressively throughout redemptive history in the Bible, right? It doesn't happen all at once. And so we've come to the sacraments in that same sort of fashion to say the Lord doesn't just unfold for us sacraments all of a sudden on the first page, but it's something that unfolds and it's linked to redemptive history, the Lord's work of keeping his promises as it unfolds sequentially. And so we've done that. But when we've done that, we've honed in on certain aspects. So to ask the question about circumcision or Passover or baptism or the Lord's Supper and seeing how that unfolds. Now we want to kind of get underneath just a little bit. We have had some, they're not really hot takes if that's like a stated belief. So we didn't come in here, and say, here's our hot take, paedobaptism, infant baptism, as a means of being a hot take. We came in to say we're Zion Presbyterian Church, a congregation in the Presbyterian Church in America. We hold to these really old standards from the 1600s called the Westminster Standards, and it outlines for us infant baptism. So, if you viewed that as a hot take, it's kind of your fault. It's like going into Pizza Hut and saying, well, you have pizza here. You're a Presbyterian and you baptize infants. Well, yes, we do. We also baptize believers. We do both. Inclusive. So now what we want to do, though, since we've laid somewhat of that groundwork, we want to back up just a little bit more to rehearse our view of how the Bible works, because some of those hot takes about how circumcision, baptism, Passover, Lord's Supper go hand in hand, are woven together And a huge part of that aspect of seeing Old Testament, New Testament, these sacraments is going together hand in hand, does tilt our hand, comes from a particular perspective that says this is how we understand the whole scope of the Bible. There are lots of people who have high views of Scripture, believe it's the inerrant, infallible, inspired Word of God, but how it works together, they have different views than we do. And so here we're just presenting and saying, here's what we think. And maybe this is helpful, how the whole Bible works together. Maybe this isn't helpful. I don't know. But that's our goal for this one. And in doing so, we're taking somewhat of the fabric of what we've talked about before and just kind of bringing it to the fore. So it may be helpful. I don't know. If you've listened up to this point and you're like, what the crack are these people talking about? I don't know. What on earth? What in the Jimmy John are these people saying? I do not understand. Maybe listen to this one and then start over. Like, not to be demoralizing, but it might help. It might help. You might hear this and be like, oh, we've tried to make it, and again, I've said this before in a previous episode. One of the things that drives me nuts are the people who use words in specific ways with specific traditions and don't explain those terms, because I'm thinking one thing and they're saying the same word I'm thinking, but they mean it in a different way than me. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And so then you feel kind of dumb and they never explain what they mean. That drives me nuts. But also I do that all the time. I'm terribly sorry if I do that. None of this was ever intended to sound demeaning or anything like that. Just sometimes I take for granted lingo that I use a lot. So sorry. But hopefully we'll explain some of that. So the first term of the day is covenant theology. So covenant theology is, we are Presbyterian. Presbyterian is actually a term for church polity, how it's structured. We are, in our church, we have presbyters and presbyteries, where pastors and elders from a variety of, locale, different churches gathered together. They're accountable to each other over an overarching denomination that's made up of pastors and elders, and local congregations, which are also made up of pastors and elders. The Greek word for elder is presbyteros, Presbyterian, presbyteros. You see how that goes. So Presbyterian just means our view of church polity. Our theology is what we call Reformed or Reformed theology. Reformation. Most people know about the Reformation. Martin Luther, short, fat, angry guy, likes craft brews and yelling.
Nailing things on doors.
Nailing things onto doors. Actually, it was common practice in the medieval world, but he was very free to do that. So Reformation, Reformed theology stems from the theology of the Reformation. More explicitly, it's not the theology that actually comes from Luther. It comes from those after, more of the continent. It's not really central on one person, but Reformed theology is that sort of thing. It gets expressed in a variety of ways. Our expression of it is the Westminster Standards, which was written in the 1640s in England. And so that's what we hold to. That's our theology. An aspect of Reformed theology, and I actually think really the core of Reformed theology, is covenant theology. So maybe we can say it this way. I have widely said, and am happy to admit the fact that I am uncultured swine. It's fine. I'm white trash from Mount Pleasant. I'm cool with it. Whatever. Do I have a Bubba Bass somewhere in my attic? And would it be on my wall if my wife would allow it? You betcha, Bobby, it would. But she won't, because she is not like me. But nonetheless, one thing that I do like that is cultured, I do like jazz. Fun fact about me, I like jazz. I like really avant-garde jazz too, that like sounds kind of crazy. and chaotic, because not for any, like, I'm not actually even really all that musical, but my family is. So I grew up with a lot of music theory in my household. And so the complexity and what's going on in the background, I know because I grew up in a household that talked about that sort of thing a lot. So I know the technicalities behind it, know that, like, that's impressive. But if you don't know the theory behind jazz, the music theory behind jazz just sounds like Reformed theology sounds a whole lot like that. If you don't have the theory behind it, which is covenant theology. If you understand covenant theology, somebody starts talking about Reformed theology, and you're like, well, yeah, that just makes sense. So here's what we mean by covenant theology, and as quick and easy of a way as we can understand. The Lord, in his mercy, has entered into a relationship specifically with mankind in two different kinds of administrations. The first administration, or the first kind of way that he enters into this covenant, is by way of the fact that we're made in the image of God. We're covenantal expressions of God, in that he's like, the word image is like, in the Bible, when it says we are, made in the image of God, he shaped us and made us vice regents to go and rule on his behalf. You see that in Genesis 1 and 2. And in that relation, as saying, these are this is special amongst creation, these image bearers of God, you will rule as my vice regents in this garden. And because there's this relationship, I am the Lord, you are not. Anytime you have any sort of engagement like that at all, anywhere, I am in charge and you are not. There are rules that go with it. One, you don't get to be God because you're not, right? You don't get to be something you're not, which makes a lot of sense. The other component was in this first administration, and we call it a variety of things. Covenant of works is the primary way that people use it. God said to Adam, you're made in my image. You're to rule on my behalf. You're to walk in holiness. And here's how you're going to do it. You're not going to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's it. And we all know the story. He doesn't do that. He's tempted. Serpent happens. And that covenantal language, not only Adam, but Adam, who's placed in charge of all of creation, who's in covenant with the Lord, who rebels against God, all of creation is plunged into sin and chaos. And then all of Adam's children after him are fallen. And so the Bible will talk about the fact that who is righteous? No, not one. David, Psalm 51, I was brought forth in iniquity. There are a lot of people who in some way will try to deny the nature of the fall, capital F. But it's one, I think it was G.K. Chesterton that said the fall is the one, the one doctrine. I'm going to butcher this. Sorry for all you Chestertonians out there. The fall is the one readily verifiable doctrine in the world. Like, you can just look around and be like, yeah, this isn't working how it probably ought to work. And part of that is because this covenant relation, the creation rebelled against God. And all the image bearers of God since Adam, minus Jesus, have rebelled against God. Because in Adam we fell, and he was our representative. And now we stand in rebellion against God, and we prove that we stand in rebellion against God because we rebel against God. And not just the own work that we do. We sin because we're sinners, and we've fallen in Adam. And so that covenant of works happens. The Lord could have condemned us in that moment. You will surely die, or as the Hebrew says, dying you will die. You'll die. Very dead. And he could have just done in that moment, but he doesn't. He enters into a different covenant. This is what we call the covenant of grace. And it goes back to Genesis 3:15. There's this promise that the seed of the woman will come and crush the head of the seed of the serpent. And as one theologian said, the rest of the Bible is a footnote to Genesis 3:15. Or stated differently, Genesis 3:15 presents us with an implicit question: who will the seed of the woman be, and how will he crush the seed of the serpent? And the rest of the Bible is explaining that reality. And one thing we do find that as that unfolds, this what we think is the covenant of grace, which starts in Genesis 3:15 and continues on and will never end. It finds its culmination, its fulfillment in Jesus, yes, but it continues on even after that. Is that what is the basis for which we come before God and say we worthily belong to Him, that we are able, in fact, to be in union with Him, to be united to God? It's not anything that we did. In fact, it's we've done everything wrong, and are in constant rebellion against the Lord just by who we are, born in Adam. The only way that we can stand before God in any sort of united way is on the basis of another person's righteousness, Christ's righteousness. I heard yesterday one of our elders was teaching a Sunday school class on the Apostles' Creed, and he referenced a different pastor that he follows that put it this way: why, if somebody presents to you the question, why should you be able to stand before God and to receive God's blessing if anything else comes out of your mouth other than He, you're wrong. And so the covenant of grace is just that thing that God in His grace and His mercy took it upon Himself unilaterally to redeem for Himself a people who will be holy in His for all eternity. And He did that through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And so the concept of covenant theology is the fact that the division, as it were, in the Bible is not that page in between the Old Testament at the end of Malachi and the New Testament in the beginning of Matthew, as one covenant theologian used to call it, that page that divided the Old Testament and the New Testament. He called it the abomination, which brings desolation. It's a Daniel joke. But the real division in Scripture is not between Old Testament and New Testament. The real division in the Bible is Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 3:14, and then Genesis 3:15 through the end of the book of Revelation. That's the real division point. And God is unfolding for us this covenant of grace that He points forward to. So that's how we see how the Bible works. From our position, we understand the Bible, and we think that there's more continuity than discontinuity. We see the Bible, as many have said, one story that's focused in and held together on the person and work of Jesus Christ. And so how this is has unfolded in history, and it's centered upon Jesus and His work fulfilling the promises of God from the beginning to the very end. And so that's how we see it. Not everybody sees it that way. There are some groups that expressly see more discontinuity than continuity, which is fine. But that's not where we're at. And so if you see discontinuity over against continuity, you're going to see the Old Testament is more different from the New Testament than we will. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that makes perfect sense.
Okay, great. So now then, that we have that basis, there is this thing called a covenant, variety of ways to define covenant, but two parties entering into some sort of agreement is like the most generic form. I think one of the better definitions of especially biblical covenants is a bond, an oath sealed in a bond of blood, as one professor and scholar would put it.
A bond in blood, sovereignly administered.
There we go. That's it. O. Palmer Robertson, if you're watching. He was in Jackson, Mississippi the other day.
You weren't.
I was not.
No.
Palmer Robertson was. O. Palmer Robertson, so covenant theology, total side. If you're looking for a good book on covenant theology, O. Palmer Robertson's book, Christ of the Covenants, is tremendous. It's very good.
It's very dense.
Yes, it's very dense. As I didn't grow up Presbyterian, didn't even come from a covenant theology sort of background. When my wife and I were thinking about moving in the direction of joining the PCA, one thing, my wife also didn't come from this sort of background. One of the books I had her read was Palmer Robertson's Christ of the Covenants, and she's brilliant. So she read it and was like, yeah, no, that makes sense. But again, she's brilliant. So it can be a good one to pick up. It is a little bit dense. You might have to read it kind of slowly. He'll use terms in particular ways. But
if you can find it, there's also a we're totally tangential now, but there is a distillation of that book that I think is out of print now, unfortunately, that was written for Sunday school classes. It's much more distilled, very, very useful.
Yeah. I've got a copy, but you can't have it.
I was going to say I've got a copy, but I'm not going to give it to anybody.
You can't have it. Maybe find it in a used bookstore. So anyway.
Share an alma mater. Me and Palmer Robertson.
There you go. Yeah. Bellhaven.
There's that.
He taught at every Reformed seminary known to man. RTS 1. Westminster. Hey, corporate sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. If you're looking for a great education, check Westminster Theological Seminary out. This was not paid for by them. Actually, my wife paid for this hoodie.
You paid for a lot.
I've paid for a lot. She's a student at Westminster, but we love Westminster, and and you're welcome, Westminster, for the free advertisement. RTS as well. Covenant, if you want to get in the game, you got to send me some swag. I'm just saying, either one of us will take it. But okay,
where were we?
Okay. Within covenant theology, just within the Bible, the term covenant is used a number of different times. It's used with Noah. It's used with Abraham. It's used with Moses. It's used with David. There is another covenant that happens in the Bible. We're not saying that, the designation of Old Testament and New Testament, Old Covenant and New Covenant is illegitimate. It's a Bible word. The term New Covenant does appear in the pages of Scripture, and so we have to wrestle with that. But one of the questions that we present, and people who hold particularly to our view of covenant theology, let me say this too. There are varieties, just to muddy the waters more. Not everybody holds to covenant theology. But within covenant theology, there are different kinds of covenant theology. The covenant theology I'm about to present in a very distilled form is, I'm going to call it a vanilla historic Presbyterian covenant theology. Vanilla. Not even really sprinkles on it. If we had more time, I'd put some sprinkles on it, because I got some hot takes. But we're not going to get there. There are other kinds of covenant theologies that have different nuances in a variety of ways. One such is Reformed Baptist covenant theology, what some will call 1689 federalism, or just Reformed Baptist covenant theology, whatever. We are Presbyterian. We're not Reformed Baptist, so we're going to present a Presbyterian form. So when I say covenant theology, hear that as the covenant theology that I'm representing, okay? Just in case there were some Reformed Baptists listening, we've done this before, but listening and like, but I do believe in covenant theology, just not like that. Yes, we love you. We love you. You know that? We love you. But we're presenting the covenant theology of the Westminster Standards. So, on that note, New Covenant. We see it happen in a variety of places, most clearly laid out. And our Reformed Baptists love this text too. We're going to read it in a little bit of a different way. But The concept of new covenant appears in Jeremiah 31, specifically verses 31 through 34. So there's obviously a progression. We're fine with that. There's a progression. It's not and nobody actually thinks this. I don't think. I could be wrong. I don't think anybody thinks this, that the covenant of grace that happens in Genesis 3 is just like a stale, it happens and it's just this stale unfolding. Like there's no progressive development, that nothing changes. Well, of course we believe that certain things change. I mean, history unfolds. Noah happens, Moses happens, Israel happens, the kingdom happens. So there's obvious development there. And then when you get to Jesus, obviously something there happens. There's an obvious change. The Sabbath changes from the last day to the first day. The Presbyterian's going to say this. Are my Baptist friends ready? You can gasp with me. The sacraments in the New Testament change. He said it. I did say it, but they didn't change how. I don't think they changed the way that a lot of people think. So let me read Jeremiah 31 through 34. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbors or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. Okay, so that sounds like a development to me. Let's tease some things out here. First, days are coming. Anytime the Bible will reference that sort of language, days are coming, particularly in prophetic language, prophetic literature, it's pointing to what it'll call elsewhere in the prophetic literature, the day of the Lord, this coming eschatological day. Eschatology means last days, last things. And so in the final days, this is going to happen. Okay. Final days. We're going to keep this short, I promise. In these last days is a term that's used throughout the New Testament to talk, actually, hold your fruit, tomatoes. It's actually to talk about the time between Christ's first coming and second coming, and I'll prove it because we like the Bible here. Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, Peter gets up and preaches a sermon, and he cites Joel 2, where he's like, here's what's happening right here, right now, in your hearing, dear brothers and sisters. Joel chapter 2, in these last days. So do the last days, are they like actual last days of like, we got like 3 days left after the ascension and then it's all happening? No. Last days is just to represent the two spans between Christ's first coming and his second. Those days obviously are over 2,000 years. But so it's a bigger span of time, and the way that they're fulfilled is not always all at once. The anticipation for new creation, which is rooted in Isaiah, we'll talk about it regularly, in a new covenant, see here in Jeremiah, finds its fullness at the end of time, as we see in Revelation 21. But there's aspects of new creation even going on now. Those who are in Christ are a new creation, Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 5. So how that's happening happens sequentially and not always as like hard and fast as we would like. So he points forward. Obviously, Jeremiah's pointing forward to a coming reality. I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah that will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of it. So concept of making a new covenant, the language here of making it is not it is not creation language. It's not even language necessarily of like old stops, done, put away, gone, new thing has come. If that were the case, then we've spent a whole, like, just take the Old Testament and cut it out. Like, if that's what that means, that he's making a new covenant, therefore the old covenant, quote unquote, it is done away with, is now null and void in every way, shape, and form, which the Bible doesn't teach that the old covenant is null and void. It says it's fulfilled, which is a different thing, which is why it's still important to us. But it's that's not language of obliteration. It's language more of anticipation. Yes, of eschatological fulfillment of. I'll use the term typological expectation, but not obliteration of the old, so that the new can replace it. It's fulfillment language. So notice the nature of the covenant too. It will not be like the covenant I made with your ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. Covenant is used in a variety of settings. That covenant that he makes clear, the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to. That's Moses. And that's Sinai, the Sinaitic covenant, or the Mosaic covenant, however you want to translate it. But covenant was in place long before Moses and Sinai. Covenant goes back to Genesis 3, yes. But this salvific covenant, the manifestation of this salvific covenant itself, of the Lord doing this one directional work where he's doing this saving, is actually going back to Abraham. And Paul makes it expressly clear, both in Romans and in Galatians, that the covenant God made with Abraham, Peter will make this clear too in his sermon yet again in Acts chapter 2, the covenant that God made with Abraham is still in force, because it is the covenant of grace. So what is happening with Moses? I said, but I wouldn't get too spicy, but I'm going to get a little spicy here. My take on covenant theology, there's a variety of ways that people will understand it. I think that the Mosaic administration, it's under the covenant. I think it is a part of the covenant of grace. There are guys that I love and respect who don't think it's part of the covenant of grace. And even then, it's like they put like little stars by it because it's confusing. Here is what I think, though, is happening with the Mosaic covenant. It's a part of the covenant of grace, yes. It starts with redemption, always. What Jeremiah is referring to here, as the Lord speaks through him, this covenant of being brought into the presence of God is not rooted simply in this ethnic, socio-political entity called Israel, as they keep holiness rituals. So again, the work, there are conditions, especially with the Mosaic administration and covenant theology. How can you enter into the presence of God? You have to go through stringent rituals, and then only once a year. You can't enter into the Holy of Holies unless you do X, Y, and Z. Being brought into the promised land, there are all kinds of blessings and cursings listed out to say as much of you can reside in the promised land if you're holy as I'm holy, and they don't, and so they're exiled. So there are conditionalities. Those are not salvific conditionalities. Those are typological expectations. And so, again, my take on this particular view is what's being addressed here, this sort of covenant that's being addressed here, is a coming time where the geopolitical boundary that is Israel is not what's in mind with being in the presence of God or being a part of the covenant community. This new covenant that's coming is the reality where suddenly there are no boundaries, there are no There is no Jew and Gentile, or male versus female, et cetera, but there are those who belong to the Lord. And it's a covenant that's been kept monergistically by Christ on our behalf. So see again that covenant of grace, the same thing. This picture happens with Abraham. I can see an earlier episode for this reality. So the covenant, this new covenant that's being spoken of, I don't think is divorced from the covenant of grace generally. It's certainly not divorced from the Abrahamic covenant or the Davidic covenant anticipating the coming Messiah. But this new covenant is there's a newness in the fact that the covenant fulfillment has taken place. That was a lot. Questions?
I don't think I have any.
Okay. Clear as mud.
Well, let me just pose the question that people are probably asking.
Yes.
What does this have to do with sacraments?
Oh, yes.
Because that's what we're talking about.
Oh, yes. Okay. So what does this have to do with sacraments? All right. So we're talking about the newness of the new covenant. Mm-hmm. What makes the new covenant new? And why do the sacraments change? Very fair question. Here's why, I think. There's a change because now the substance of the covenant itself has come. So in the Old Testament, these covenants have sacraments. These are signs and seals. That's true, but they're shadowy. They're in expectation. There's a longing for and a promise that's put forth before the people of God to say, the Lord's going to keep his promise. The Lord's going to keep his promise. Just wait, the Lord's going to keep his promise. When we turn, the newness of the new covenant is now the promises have been fulfilled and the substance has arrived, which has immediately inaugurated a new epoch, but not a new covenant. It's the same covenant because it's the same promise that God made back specifically with Abraham. You can go back further, even into Genesis 3. But the substance, the foundation of that has come in the person of Christ. And so, without laying all of that very lengthy, I understand, framework, you're going to come and you're just going to say, okay, Old Testament is Old Testament, New Testament is New Testament. And then when you come to the sacraments, you're going to say, sacraments are baptism and the Lord's Supper, and that's that, and move on, where you've missed the fullness of this covenant reality, of the covenant of grace. And so our view, again, where we come from as Presbyterians holding to the Westminster Standards, if you understand it as simply Old Testament versus New Testament instead of covenant of works versus covenant of grace, you're going to view the sacraments differently. So with that, here's what we're saying, or what we're not saying. We are not saying that in the Old Covenant and in the New Covenant, there's a different covenant of grace. It's the same covenant of grace. Here's what we are saying. There are changes in a variety of ways. There's a change in epoch, right? The Old Testament is anticipating as a shadowy thing the coming fulfillment of the substance that God has promised. So there's a change in day. We are in the last days now, the Bible is able to say. In some sense, this is interesting. There's even a change in revelation. The Lord, the author of Hebrews will pick up this way. Many times and in many ways, the Lord spoke to us by the fathers through his prophets. But now, here's the change. How has he spoken to us? He's spoken to us by his Son. And you can go to the prologue of John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And there at the end, he who is in the bosom of the Father, he is making the Father known. He's revealing him to us. And so now, again, hear that substantive language. What is God like? Christ. There's a change in Sabbath, last day to first day. There's a change in sign, even. This is a huge hoopla that we've talked about before. When you turn, especially to Acts chapter 15, book of Galatians, same. What about circumcision? Because circumcision, even with Abraham, and Abraham, like it's all about grace with Abraham, but to be a part of the covenant community, you gotta, the covenant sign of circumcision is vital. And we don't circumcise anymore. Well, that's right. We baptize now. There's a change in sign. There's not a change in thing signified. We'll get there in a minute. Now then, the big thing, though, that we're saying and what makes our understanding specifically of covenant theology, and not only covenant theology, but our view of the sacraments, which goes with your understanding of covenant theology, what we don't think changes, though there's a change in epoch, revelation, Sabbath, sign, there's not a change in the members of the covenant. So here's what we mean by that. In the Old Covenant, very well attested to, I think we can all hold hands in kumbaya over this one. From Abraham on, who are to be viewed as the members of the covenant community? Believers. That's right, believers. Good. Believers and believers' children. And we see this in like Genesis 15. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. The promises are for you and for your children, which is why children were circumcised on the 8th day, right? They're to be viewed. That's not saying in that moment, this is another thing to our dear Roman Catholic. If you're watching this, we appreciate you. Thank you. And our dearly beloved Lutheran friends, if you're watching this, we love you too. Where there's conflation or confusion with sign and thing signified, it's very well attested to that circumcision was not regeneration. It was not one and the same. Circumcision signified regeneration, but there's still the call regularly throughout the Old Testament, be circumcised in order to be a part of the covenant community, but also anticipate and wait the circumcision of your heart, which is regenerative language. And so that same reality takes place in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, the before Christ, the BC. The same covenant reality is taking place there. The big difference is now Christ has come. And so with this coming of Christ to inaugurate, represent, demonstrate the new reality of that the substance has come, there is a change in sign, but not a change in the thing signified. Be washed with the washing of regeneration, the Bible will tell us. The water is the sign. It's representing, signifying, sealing a variety of things. Regeneration and remission of sins are two things. But that doesn't happen in the same time. We don't want to conflate and confuse. So just as it takes place in the old that the covenant sign goes to both believers and the children of believers, it's our thought that in the new, likewise it happens. And we think this appears on the pages of Scripture itself. Acts chapter 2, famously, what should we do to be saved, Peter? You just preached this amazing sermon, and it's, these are the last days and all of this stuff. What do we need to do? You need to be baptized and repent, for the promises are for you and for your children and for all who are far off. That same language that was used in Genesis 3:15 is now used in Acts chapter 2 and in a variety of other places. Very similar things in Romans chapter 4, Acts chapter 10, Acts chapter 16, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that children are not regenerate by way of genetics. Nobody's saying that. The Old Testament doesn't say that. The New Testament doesn't say that. We're not saying that. But the children of believers, in our view, are to be viewed as set apart for the Lord. You can see that in Malachi chapter 2. Paul makes that case in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that the children, even of one believer, is to be viewed as holy unto the Lord. These are the Lord's children. So this work that the Lord does of both believers and the children of believers, that's our understanding. Children are to be viewed who belong to the church as belonging to the church and therefore receive this initiatory rite as the covenant of grace. And that's our view. See the continuity? That's the continuity that we're seeing. Again, I know that's a lot. Sorry for the word vomit there, guys.
No, I think that's good. I think that's about as concise an idea as you can get for what we're kind of getting at. And I think that our episodes on circumcision and baptism can really, if you want to dig deeper into all of those intricacies, and maybe in the future, if you want us to, we can do more on that. But
we can.
But I think that as far as like a 30,000 and maybe even a 50,000 foot view of what's going on, I think that's
okay. Good. So now then, let's talk about similarities and differences between the sacraments in the new covenant. Okay. So we get to the new covenant. The sign changes between new covenant and old covenant. We've established that. The thing signified is the same sort of thing, but how it's signed is different. So with the sacraments, baptism is baptism, Lord's Supper is Lord's Supper. They are not the same thing. So how are they similar and how are they different? Well, thankfully, our standards address this. Westminster Large Catechism 176 puts it this way: wherein do the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper agree? Here's where they agree. Here's how they're similar. The sacraments, baptism, and Lord's Supper agree in that the author of both is God. Good. The spiritual part of both is Christ and his benefits. So that's what we're, in both of those, the spiritual part of both is Christ and his benefits. That's what we're receiving. Both are seals of the same covenant, covenant of grace, and are dispensed by ministers of the gospel and by none other, and to be continued in the church of Christ until his second coming. So there it is. We're gonna baptize people. We think believers and their infants, if they so choose. And we're going to do that until Christ comes back, and we're going to participate of the Lord's Supper until we get to the big supper, the marriage supper of the Lamb. So that's how they're similar. They're from God. They're pointing to Christ. They're signing and sealing the same covenant of grace, the same realities of Christ and his benefits. Good. Wherein do they differ? Well, question 177 asks that question and answers it for us. The sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper differ in that baptism is to be administered but once, with water to be a sign and the seal of our regeneration and engrafting into Christ. Hear that? Engrafted into Christ. And that even to infants. Whereas the Lord's Supper, it's different. It's not the same as baptism. Whereas the Lord's Supper is to be administered often, perpetually, continually, regularly, in the elements of bread and wine to represent and exhibit Christ as spiritual nourishment for the soul, and to confirm our continuance and growth in him, and that only to such as are of years and ability to examine themselves. So again, if you're confused on that, see our previous episode on the need to discern and the warning passages throughout. So they're similar, but there are distinctions of, and I think you can tease this out just grammatically. Baptism is a passive sacrament. You are baptized. You don't. Well, I do because I'm a pastor. I baptize. But when you are baptized, you don't baptize yourself, which is actually not even an active voice. That's a middle voice. But you are baptized. There's a passiveness. It's applied to you. Lord's Supper, you take of the Lord's Supper. It's an active voice. You are participating in the Lord's Supper. Active voice. And the Greek teases that out because there's a passive voice, there's an active voice in both. And so that's one of the distinct elements, that baptism is a passive sacrament. Lord's Supper is an active sacrament. Baptism is to occur once. Again, we understand if you're Baptist, like more than one baptism, because if it comes after regeneration, then okay. But our view is like, if it happened at some point, great. And whenever those realities come to fruition of regeneration, which is interesting too, that like Baptists don't believe that the water regenerates you anyway. They think you should be regenerate before you come to the water. We're saying a similar thing of like, yeah, the water doesn't regenerate you. We just think it more often than not probably happens after, but probably doesn't happen in the moment, though it could. It could happen in the moment if the Lord really wanted to. But anyway, but only happens once, whereas the Lord's Supper is to be regular. I think a pretty compelling case can be made for weekly. I like having weekly communion. That is my preference. That is not a law. But anyway, so that's how they're different.
Okay.
So we've got similarities and differences between the Old Testament and New Testament. We have similarities and differences between the sacraments in the New Testament of baptism and Lord's Supper. So hopefully that's answered everyone's question.
Yeah. Who could have questions after that?
I know. Like,
well, next week.
Well, on that note, we're asking questions.
Yeah. Next week we're gonna do some question and answer. As always, you can leave your questions here, and we will get them on future episodes. We're gonna keep collecting and keep answering.
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
So we'll be back next week. Thank you.
Thank you.